The nightmare scenario, and I've said this directly to President Zelensky in the past, is to be South Vietnam, to be a country that has support from the United States for a time, but then the support runs out, a peace is agreed, but the peace isn't stable, and in the end, South Vietnam in 1975 vanished.
Do you have an opinion how to actually end this war?
I do. I think you have to break the question up into two parts. Ukraine can keep the war going. It can deny Russia victory by an extraordinary combination of technological ingenuity and human courage. And that is why the war is still going, and I think can keep going. But that's only part of what has to happen. To end the war, that requires pressure on Russia that Ukraine alone cannot exert, even with its deep strikes into Russian territory. That means that the United States, plus its European and other partners, must impose much tougher and more effective sanctions on the Russian economy to raise the cost to Vladimir Putin of continuing this war. And that has not yet happened. There still is not sufficient pressure on Russia's oil exports, nor has there been sufficient pressure to reduce exports to Russia through third countries, from European economies mainly. So that's the only way I think this war can be ended. It can be kept going by Ukraine, but it cannot be ended without external pressure on Russia. Yes, there are some stresses and strains in the Russian economy, as you would expect, as we are in the fourth year of a war which has more than doubled Russian military expenditure. But if you look at the state of the Russian economy, the most striking thing is the extent to which they have successfully increased their armaments production. It's very impressive if one looks at the statistics, and I think they check out on the battlefield. And they've done that without impacting Russian living standards. In fact, real wages and consumption and retail spending are all up significantly since the war began. So anyone who thinks that the Russian economy is on the point of collapse is deluding themselves. The reality is that the Russian economy, despite the obvious weakness relative to the Soviet past, is still capable of ramping up military production and sustaining this war effort. Let me add one other crucial point. Without Chinese support, financial as well as in the form of dual-use technology, it would be much harder for Putin to continue this war. And that Chinese backstop has been much more consistent than Western aid to Ukraine, because Western aid to Ukraine has been subject to the vagaries of American politics. In effect, the war is now a European enterprise because American military and financial aid have stopped. But China continues to support President Putin, and Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, consistently affirms the strength of his relationship with Putin. So that is the other reason why Russia's economy is not about to fall apart.
But is it possible to actually do something about the Chinese support? Because we saw a few weeks back with Kim, Xi, Putin, even Modi hugging it out at the Shanghai summit. It looks like Europe doesn't actually have the necessary power to pressure China to stop this support, right? And the US doesn't want to do it.
This is the central problem from a geopolitical and geo-economic point of view that Ukraine faces. Its struggle with Russia is part of a global struggle. On one side, you have the Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and North Korean economies. You can call them the axis of authoritarians or the axis of upheaval, but they are a functional axis, engaged in all kinds of military and economic cooperation. And on the other side, you have what we used to call the West. But when you look closely at the West, it's actually quite divided. There isn't consistent strategic purpose. The United States is very reluctant to impose direct costs on Russia or indeed on China, President Trump seems to want to sort these problems out with high-level summits, first with Putin, now he hopes next with Xi Jinping. I'm very skeptical that these summits are going to produce any concrete results. From China's point of view, this war is the gift that keeps on giving. The Chinese are selling drone components and drones to both sides. So they have no incentive to stop this war, and nor does Russia, because I think Putin calculates that eventually the superiority of resources in terms of GDP and manpower will give him victory, even if it costs another million Russian soldiers dead and wounded. He therefore has no incentive to settle. This is the problem Ukraine can do nothing about. Ukraine can keep this war going with ingenuity, courage, but you can't end it unless there's a fundamental shift in the geopolitical alignment, which I don't see.
I want to remind you that we have a membership program at the Kyiv Independent. Supporting the Kyiv Independent allows us to do the videos like this and report on the war in Ukraine. Thank you. Judging by what you said, is the West, if there's still a West, is playing catch-up, because basically the Axis, whatever we call it, is united, is strong, and has its purpose, and Europe alone can't do anything about it, and we're still really dependent on the mood swings in Washington.
As you know, as every Ukrainian knows, this war is a war of hardware, of drones and drone defenses, of all kinds of very complex but still relatively cheap forms of weaponry. And if one looks at the global economy, there is no question which economy dominates the production of drones and drone components, and that is China. China's manufacturing value added is roughly twice that of the United States of America. It's double the manufacturing capability of the United States. Europe isn't close. Europe can just about match Russia's defense production. So the problem is that Europe, which now is the principal source of support for Ukraine, is far behind the United States and China in terms of its defense capability. Europe roughly needs to double, perhaps more than double, its defense capability. Now, the good news is that President Trump succeeded in persuading the Europeans to increase their defense spending, and that is good, and it's long overdue. The bad news is that Europe is constrained in, I think, three different ways. Number one, it doesn't really have the kind of strength in defense technology that the US and China have. It's far behind, particularly in the most sophisticated kinds of weaponry. Number two, the public finances of most European countries are in very bad shape. France, it's a mess. The UK, it's a mess. Italy, don't even go there. Only Germany has fiscal capacity. And that is a real constraint on how many resources can be mobilized for large-scale European rearmament. And finally, populist parties are in the ascendant in all the major economies, and most of the minor ones too. A party called Reform UK is far ahead of the governing Labour Party in the UK. The same is true in France, where the Rassemblement National is far ahead of President Macron's party. And in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland is basically neck and neck with the governing CDU. And these parties are not particularly keen on support for Ukraine. In some cases, they seem to show sympathy for the Russian side. So these are the problems, again, beyond Ukraine's control, that I think are really constraining the amount of resources that can be made available to ending this war.
Since we're on the topic of Europe, recently, last week, Poland was attacked by Russian drones. We had Minister Sikorsky saying that it was a successful operation of downing the drones, even though not all of them were down. People in Ukraine see this as Russia probing European defenses, say a salami tactic where they do something, they see the reaction, there's no reaction, they increase the pressure. And people in Ukraine as well, they think that Russia was successful in probing NATO defenses, and NATO didn't push back against Russia in any tangible way. Does this send a signal to Russia that it can attack NATO countries, it can meddle with their internal affairs, and it won't face any repercussion for that?
I don't believe that President Putin's goals are simply to acquire more territory from Ukraine. I don't even think he would be content with breaking Ukraine as an independent democratic state. His ultimate objective is to break NATO and to show that NATO is no longer real, that the language of Article 5 is a dead letter. How can he achieve this? Well, he can achieve this not just by winning the war in Ukraine, but then by expanding Russian aggression into NATO member states and showing that it doesn't elicit a united response. And it's not just the drones that entered Polish airspace. There have been other provocations. There are other ways Russia is pushing the envelope, for example, in the Baltic area. And I think it's highly concerning that the NATO response, particularly to the most recent Polish events, has been so weak. One of the lessons of the original Cold War, when it was the Soviet Union on the other side, was that you could not let that kind of aggression pass without at least strong language implying some kind of retaliatory risk. We're not doing that. And we consistently, I think since February of 2022, I would actually say since 2021, failed to be sufficiently strong in our responses to acts of Russian aggression and provocation. It's as if we've forgotten the language of deterrence and replaced it with the language of de-escalation. But anybody who's ever been in a fight, in a pub or in the schoolyard knows that when somebody slaps you in the face, you don't win the fight by saying, let's de-escalate. And so this is the problem. We've forgotten the basics of deterrence. And my urgent message to NATO's leaders, as well as to the leaders of the NATO member states, is you have to do more. You have to show the Russians there is a price for a sustained violation of Polish airspace. And that price must be paid in ways that are meaningfully costly to the Russian war effort in Ukraine.
During the Second World War, there was an appeasement slogan, why die for dancing, right? Do you think Europeans and Americans would be willing to die for Narva, for example, if Russia enters Estonia?
Well, formally, they have to be. That's the whole point of NATO, that an attack on one is an attack on all, and there will therefore be a coordinated alliance response. If it turns out that that's no longer true, then we are back to the pre-NATO world when it was possible for aggressors to pick off European countries one by one. Czechoslovakia, 1938, Poland, 1939. We all know the history. But as an historian, the tragedy of my career is that I've spent years of my life writing books and articles and giving lectures and classes and seminars about these issues, trying to communicate to the next generation the simple truths about great power politics, as well as economic forces in history. And it's as if I might as well not have bothered. We've reached the point when Tucker Carlson can invite people on his show who argue that the real villain of World War II was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was the hero of World War II because there was one man who argued against appeasement consistently, even when it was unpopular. So it's very frustrating for me to see so many of the lessons of history apparently forgotten. And I have to say, it's urgently, vitally important for Western leaders, and I include the President of the United States in this, to push back against false narratives of history. Because these false narratives very rapidly lead you back to the isolationism that was such a disaster for the United States in the 1930s and culminated at Pearl Harbor, as well as the appeasement that failed so miserably in Europe in 1938-39.
Do you see historical parallels with the current situation, with maybe the Second World War or any other historic events?
Part of the danger in historical discussion is that sometimes certain historical analogies get overused. So every dictator is Hitler, every crisis is Munich, is Czechoslovakia in 1938. I'm not sure that's really the right analogy for the situation in Ukraine. In some ways, it's much more reminiscent of the Korean War, in the sense that you've got a very clear act of aggression that elicits an international response and then produces a military stalemate with a very, very dangerous extended frontier. And then you have peace negotiations, which are extremely hard to progress. It's hard, in fact, for me to imagine how we would arrive at peace anytime soon under the present circumstances. A good outcome for Ukraine would be to be South Korea. In many ways, it already is South Korea. You can see this in the incredible advances in Ukraine's defense technology, something South Korea is still world famous for, but also in the progress that Ukraine has made towards being a democracy with a strong sense of identity. In fact, it took Korea much longer to get to democracy than Ukraine. So that feels like a better analogy. The nightmare scenario, and I've said this directly to President Zelensky in the past, is to be South Vietnam, to be a country that has support from the United States for a time, but then the support runs out, a peace is agreed, but the peace isn't stable, and in the end, South Vietnam in 1975 vanished, 2 years after a peace agreement had been reached. That's the nightmare scenario. I think these analogies are more helpful than World War II analogies because we're actually in another Cold War. This is a Cold War as cold as the Cold War that began in the late 1940s. It's just that China has taken the place of the Soviet Union. In other respects, the cast of characters is somewhat similar and the central problems are fundamentally the same problems.
I know historians don't really like to give predictions, but since we're talking about the current situation, what needs to be done and what's not actually happening, do you have a sense where this is all going? How we will see the world end up, say, next year or in the upcoming years?
Predictions are all very well, but I actually think actions are preferable. A year ago, I went to Berlin and strongly argued that the approaching government of Friedrich Merz should relax the debt brake and engage in large-scale rearmament. And that has happened. Now, the next step is to make sure that that rearmament is the right kind of rearmament, that is to say, that the money is spent on the right weapon systems, and secondly, that it happens fast enough to influence the outcome in Ukraine. So I'm not particularly interested in making predictions at the moment. The reason that I'm here is to try to contribute to the drastically needed upgrade of European strategy. This is Europe's war now, but Europe is not doing what it needs to do to help Ukraine win it and end the war. So that's what we have to change.
Do you think it ever will do the right thing?
I think it's possible. I think things are moving rapidly. Germany has great manufacturing capabilities. It does not have fiscal constraints in the way that France and Britain do. And I think Friedrich Merz understands how urgently Germany needs to transform its strategic framework. He spent years opposing Angela Merkel's Ostpolitik with Russia. Now he has a chance to put those arguments into action. The constraints on him, I think, are partly his coalition partners, the Social Democrats, who have never been, I think, sufficiently committed to Ukrainian victory. But I remain of the view that if we give him encouragement, and if he has other European leaders on his side, then Germany has the capacity to make a major contribution. What are the two words you least want to hear if you are a Russian dictator? I'll tell you, German rearmament. That is happening. There's going to come a point, if it's done right and if it's done fast enough, when Vladimir Putin will realize that he has made the biggest strategic mistake in modern Russian history by reawakening Germany as a military power.